Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions, as well as those joining us on the C-SPAN network. We would ask everyone in-house to be so kind to check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as a courtesy. And, of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our program today and welcoming and introducing our special guest is Heritage's Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus, Chairman of our Meese Legal Center, as well as the 75th Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Meese. Mr. Meese.
Thank you, John, and ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I join John in welcoming you to the Heritage Foundation here, and particularly for this program today. Heritage has, over the years, done a great deal in the policing, law enforcement, and public safety areas, and we certainly are very pleased to have our keynote speaker today. And it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce him, since we have known each other for a number of years. Believe it or not, I think we first met when we were both at Harvard, believe it or not, for the executive session in policing that they had some years ago. You know, the United States has had many fine police chiefs over the last century or more, but there were some that I would call the kind of a very exclusive group of the finest people who have had an impact on the police profession through an entrepreneurial spirit and with a good deal of imagination and innovation in improving policing in the United States. It goes back actually almost a century ago. August Vollmer, who was the chief of police in Berkeley, California. Kind of interesting that that's where improved policing started in view of what's going on today. August Vollmer, and he was also chief of police for a brief time in Los Angeles. And then in the middle of the last century, Bill Parker in Los Angeles and Stanley Schroetel in Cincinnati. And then they were followed by O.W. Wilson in Chicago and Pat Murphy in New York, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. Well, I want to say that there's no question that these leaders in police excellence formed a distinguished group in which today's keynote speaker, as an innovator, as an imaginative leader, and as a person who has done very much uniquely, has had a unique place in policing excellence in this country, and has, in many ways, has had a unique career that is very difficult for anyone, I think, to follow and duplicate what he has done. He's headed 6 police departments, including some of the largest, the 2 largest in the country. He has done an outstanding job in all of the police departments that he's headed, and has really set a standard for police leadership. He has, in a sense, invented language. Nobody knew that there was such a thing as ComStat until he came along and developed it. And now almost every large police department in the country is using some form of ComStat. In addition, he has had in all of the departments in which he has provided leadership 3 results in each one. The first has been improved policing. The second has been decreased crime, and the third has been better relationships between the community and the police. This is a terrific record, and that's why we're so pleased to have him here today. I could say more about him, but I think you're going to listen to him, and I think it'll be well worth your attention to hear what he has to say about policing in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and an outstanding leader of the law enforcement profession, Bill Bratton.
Good morning. And it is a good morning. General, I want to thank you for that more than gracious introduction. The General and I do go back a long way, that we first met at the Harvard Kennedy School executive sessions on policing. late 80s, early 90s. I was the chief of the superintendent of the Metropolitan Police in Boston at that time, a state police agency. And the executive sessions, more so than just about any other government activity that I'm aware of over the last 50 years, shaped American policing and shaped it for the better. We are still a profession that is developing, evolving continually, but a major revolution was created during those sessions. Not widely known was the general's role in that. As Attorney General, through the National Institute of Justice, Chip Stewart, it was funded. And a Republican administration funding an executive session at one of the most liberal colleges, universities in the United States, created what effectively was community policing. Community policing that oftentimes, in the politicization that we oftentimes bring to these issues, was largely associated with Democratic administrations in the 90s, was effectively created by funding and active participation of the Reagan administration, but in the person of the Attorney General, who attended, despite his incredibly busy schedule, every session of that over many years. And so he's to be applauded, and I am an extraordinary admirer of him. It is an unheralded accomplishment on his part, and I welcome the opportunity today to remind people just how instrumental he was personally and in his capacity as Attorney General in helping to point American policing in a very defining way at a very difficult time in the history of our country. I thank him for the second time inviting me here to the Heritage Foundation to give a speech on this issue. First time was 1996 in October, 21 years ago. I had shortly before left the NYPD, working with Mayor Giuliani, and this time I've been out of the NYPD for the second time, having worked for Mayor de Blasio. Two individuals from totally different spectrums, Republican, conservative, progressive, liberal, Democrat. Myself, I like to think I can work with anybody. And so by giving those two examples, I think that's proof positive that I can. I want to acknowledge the report that's being distributed today, that I was not able to attend the symposium that was held earlier this year by the Heritage Foundation, and the number of reports that came from that. I had the opportunity to read all of them. They have helped to inform my prepared remarks, as well as some of my extemporaneous that I will make, and some of the questions that will follow. I was very taken with the substance of them all, and some in particular. A number of them written by very close colleagues of mine, that Gary McCarthy from Chicago, formerly Chicago PD, NYPD, Newark PD, wrote an extraordinary piece on the issue of bias and race on this issue. Noble contributed significantly. Chip Stewart, several papers that he put in. And again, I thank those people for their continuing contribution to the dialogue. I see Chuck Wexler. Chuck and I have worked together since 1975, now the director of PERF. PERF, like the Heritage Foundation, keenly interested in these issues, and it's been my pleasure over the years to be affiliated with PERF, affiliated by invitation with the Heritage Foundation. So hopefully today there will be the opportunity to discuss, as they say in the paper, Policing in America, Lessons from the Past, Opportunities for the Future. I think I can speak to the past, speak to the current situation, and offer some thoughts going forward, where there is so much contention at the moment about where do we need to go at this particular point in time. The remarks, the comments are mine. I've been in the business for almost 50 years, starting with 3 years in the military police in 1967. I think I've seen the arc of policing over this incredible time, a continual period of evolution with many periods of revolution. The community policing initiative that the Attorney General led was one of those revolutions. CompStat, that I had the privilege of being a part of, was another. And I'll talk about several others. So with that introduction, I thank you once again, Attorney General, that the company I currently work with, Teneo, my division, Teneo Risk, works almost exclusively with the private sector. So ironically, after 50 years, that I'm very limited in my involvement with policing, where I put most of my life. But the private sector's needs are the same as the needs of American policing, dealing now in the 21st century with terrorism, dealing with cybercrime issues, dealing with social media issues. The combination between private and public is effectively what community policing was all about, the idea of collaboration, because we all have shared interests. With that, let me speak to you about the paper that I'm presenting. First, let me give you a title: Cops Count, Police Matter, Preventing Crime and Disorder in the 21st Century, Preventing Crime and Disorder. They are linked. I passionately believe that preventing crime and disorder is the key to successful policing rather than measurement of our response to it. And it has been since Sir Robert Peel articulated 9 principles for the profession of policing. My original copy of those 9 principles of policing. They are effectively my Bible, my foundation. Written in 1829, they are more relevant today in the 21st century than they were back in 1829. His first principle is the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent, I emphasize prevent, crime and I emphasize the and, disorder. The 3 go together. More importantly, when they go together, they are successful. And to a large part of our history, particularly over these last 50 years, they did not. And so in the 70s and 80s, we lost our way. The 90s, with the guidance of the Community Policing Initiative, we got back to the basic mission for which the police exist. His 9th principle is the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. Meaning, if you can reduce crime and disorder, the need for police to be seen effectively engaging in the suppression of crime and disorder, their time can be spent more effectively and more productively collaborating with communities, working together. The idea that it's the visibility of the enforcement that generates so much of the hostility. And in today's 21st century world of videos, there's not a week that goes by there is not that video where police are using force, and the video representation of that force, whether it's lawful but looks awful, it pulls us further apart rather than brings us together. So if we can, in fact, reduce crime and disorder to such an extent we can reduce police necessity for use of force, that will bring us a long way toward bringing us together. I believe that 9 principles have been key long before they were first enunciated in 1829. For as long as society and democratic governments have entrusted and empowered some of their citizens, we, the police, and we are a citizen police in this country, to keep others safe. In our country, the first obligation of government is public safety, enshrined in our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, public safety. That obligation is fulfilled principally in our criminal justice system, and most visibly, the role and responsibility of the police. Cops Count, Police Matter is a term I've used first used in the LAPD in 2003 as part of the rebuilding of that very damaged organization, which had effectively ceased to police the city of Los Angeles. Crime was rising, spirits were low, morale was deplorable, and as a way of inspiring that department, came up with that mantra. In simple terms, it means that the individual actions of cops count, good and bad, and that the actions of police departments and the police profession, good and bad, matter. Cops count, police matter. We can ensure that those actions are good more often than bad if we are always guided by what I would describe as the 3 C's and a T. We need to police constitutionally. Can't break the law to enforce it. We need to police compassionately. We are policing fellow citizens. We are policing people. We need to police consistently, not police differently in poor neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods than we might in white neighborhoods, richer neighborhoods. And at all times, and increasingly in the 21st century, with the advent of cameras, we need to police with transparency. There can be no denying that through much of our history, particularly in our relations with African Americans, our actions and those of our government that directed those actions were shaped by our country's original sin, the scourge of slavery. Nearly 300 years of slavery on this continent, more than 100 years of Jim Crow laws following, a terrible national legacy that we still deal with today. Likewise, many of our actions with immigrants, legal and illegal, and with the Native Americans whose land this was first, and with other marginalized groups, were often shaped by societal and political prejudice, racism, bigotry, and homophobia. But policing in the last quarter of the 20th century and now into the 21st is changing for the better rapidly in so many fundamental ways, and I have been part and privileged to be part of that change. In that regard, we, the police, need to shape the narrative, the opinions, and the rhetoric. We have not been doing that very well. We need to write the real American police story, blemishes and all. Under no circumstance can we allow it to be framed primarily by those who don't like us, respect us, or trust us. Nor can we allow it to be framed by those who seek to advance their own societal beliefs and social agendas by denigrating the heartfelt, the reasonable, practical, and effective efforts of police leadership to change and improve. I've been associated with police leadership through most of my career. Know many of the police leaders of the past and of today. They are an extraordinary group of progressive thinkers who face these issues with open minds and a determination, a pride in their profession, and a determination to really help address the many issues that police are expected to address, plus the many others that by default have fallen to us. Police can and must stay focused not only on the prevention of crime, but also disorder. There has been great debate about the concept of broken windows and quality of life. I say to you, it is essential to effective policing that we focus on both crime, serious, and we focus also at the same time on quality of life. The two go together. In the 70s and 80s, we separated them, and we saw the disaster of 1990, the worst crime year in the history of this country. Police prevent crime, and they prevent disorder. And they do so by changing behavior, and that is so incredibly important. They do so with targeted enforcement, not indiscriminate enforcement, nor, as we discuss issues of immigration, with immigration sweeps of people who've done nothing but enter here illegally, even though that is a crime. They do so by working with prosecutors to seek full force but fair sentencing, not a return to harsh guidelines that eliminate judicial discretion and fill prisons with people who aren't impact players and can be dealt with much more effectively in other environments. And they do so through neighborhood engagement, where police work with people to prevent problems and realize their potential in the neighborhoods too, the genesis and the genius of community policing. It's that simple. It really is that simple. We have made it too complex. I spent nearly 50 years in the profession of policing as a military policeman in Vietnam, starting as a patrol cop, walking a beat in an all-black neighborhood in Boston that 2 years before was an all-Jewish white neighborhood, but through the real estate busting that went on in that city at that time, and then spent the next number of years dealing with desegregation of schools, desegregation of public housing in one of the most segregated northern cities in America, perhaps even more segregated than many in the South at that time. And as a leader and change agent, as the Attorney General referenced, at 6 different police departments, one 68 police officers, another with 38,000. So I basically managed or directed or led police departments of every size in this country. During that time, the profession has swung like a pendulum from prevention to response and back to prevention. Without false modesty, I believe that I played a large role with many of my colleagues in the swing back to the focus on prevention that occurred actually beginning in the 1990s. That was, in fact, reinforced by the efforts of the executive session, focusing effort back on prevention and not on response. My concern now is that we may be swinging back. I watch with great concern the pendulum back to the days of the 70s and 80s. We don't need to go that way. We have found in the 90s and in the 21st century other ways to do it. American police chiefs in particular understand that because they've been living it. If we see history as a pendulum, we can see the swing away from prevention in the 1960s, away from the model on the cop on the beat who knew his neighborhood and took active steps, at times discretionary steps, to maintain order and prevent crime. Sir Robert Peel. And while we idolize Officer Friendly as the cop on the beat who controlled behavior and kept the neighborhood safe, or for that matter, my personal hero, Detective Joe Friday of the Los Angeles Police of the 50s and 60s, who focused on responding to crime, but never with compassion. Never saw Joe Friday put his arm around anybody. He solved the crime, but basically the LAPD model at that time was response-oriented and keep your distance from the public. We must acknowledge that efforts at crime prevention and disorder control in that era were not always fair nor just. As George Kelling and James Q. Wilson, two personal heroes of mine, George Kelling's been a friend and mentor and advisor for most of my police life, and James Wilson, I had the privilege before his passing to spend a lot of time with him. As they pointed out in their Broken Windows article, some of those steps, and I quote here, meaning the actions of the police, probably would not withstand a legal challenge today. Sometimes officers enforce social mores rather than the law, and social mores can be ephemeral, unfair, and discriminatory. This was certainly true during the civil rights era. The social upheaval and unrest of that era and the terrible riots sent the pendulum hurtling from one extreme to the other. It swung from too much discretion in the hands of officers all the way over to the response era of the 70s and 80s. The much-needed rulings such as Miranda, Escobedo, exclusionary rule, they were necessary to correct the abuses of the past, the third degree, the failure to inform people under arrest of their rights. They were necessary changes to deal with the issues of the 60s as we moved into the 70s and 80s, but pendulum swung too far. Police corruption gave rise to police oversight, and police reform grew out of reports like the Kerner Commission, and all of it commingled with new ideas about the origins of crime. Kerner Commission report. I had to read this book, literally almost memorize it, to take my sergeant's promotional exam in 1974 in the Boston Police Department. It was part of the professionalization and liberalization of police agencies at that time. The books I had to study to pass the promotional exam for sergeant. I was the youngest sergeant ever promoted in the history of the Boston Police Department at age 27, a sign of the changing times. We read this book. We read the American Bar Association report on race relations in the United States. We read Wisenhand. I read Iannone on management and theory. The idea of one of the recommendations of this book, the professionalization of the police. But this report and the preceding crime report that the President Lyndon Johnson had commissioned set us on a path for the next 20 years that literally brought us to the 1990s. While there were so many extraordinary good recommendations here, a lot of what we talk about today, legitimacy of policing efforts, there was one that really tore us apart. The idea that we should focus on response to crime, that they believed at that time that the causes of crime were racism, were poverty, were police practices in many instances, unemployment, demographics. They thought those were the causes. They were not, they are not, and never have been. But for 20 years, and I lived it, American policing was shaped by it. And I'll point to one line here in the report that sticks out to me, the idea that in alleviating manpower to the ghetto, enforcement emphasis should be given to crimes that threaten life and property, stress on social gambling or loitering when more serious crimes are neglected, not only diverts manpower, but fosters distrust and tension in the ghetto community. In that line, they advocated that American policing move away from disorder control, not understanding that African Americans in their neighborhoods, Latinos in their neighborhoods, rich and poor, all want the same thing. Nobody wants the prostitute in the doorway. Nobody wants the gang in the corner dealing drugs. Nobody wants the graffiti, whether you're white or black. But effectively, what they advocated in that report, with so many great suggestions, that and the earlier crime report, the emphasis on responding to crime. And that's what we did in the 70s, 80s. 911 came into being, and we responded. Celebrated we could get there in 8 minutes initially. Then it became 30 minutes and 40 minutes, and many times we never came. We celebrated the idea of reactive investigation, Joe Friday, technology, all types of things to solve the crime after the fact. And we celebrated man the patrol, moving officers around in vehicles to get them more rapidly to those 911 calls to the crimes that had already occurred. We moved from Sir Robert Peel's prevention of crime focus to response. And for 20 years, it basically ran us down the rabbit hole. And then in the 1990s, with the help of the executive sessions, American police leadership, community leadership, we began to get it right. And what did we get right? The cause of crime is people, criminals, or emotionally disturbed, of which those numbers are growing, or others in moments of passion commit criminal acts. The others are influences. And certainly the police don't have control on those influences, but we can have impact on them. So we have righted the ship starting in the 1990s. This report, while so valuable, effectively, in many respects, moved us in the wrong direction, and fortunately we moved back. The social upheaval and unrest of that era and the terrible riots sent the pendulum hurtling from one extreme to the other, as I've mentioned. It swung from too much discretion in the hands of officers all the way to the response era of the 90s, 70s, and 80s. Police corruption gave rise to police oversight, and as I referenced, reports such as the current. Crime became less about what Johnny did to Joe, and increasingly about what made Johnny act the way he did. The desire to focus on root causes was well-intentioned, noble even, but they weren't the causes, they were the influences. But if it was a new way to look at Johnny's behavior, it didn't always help Joe. Joe still remained the victim. The advent of 911 in 1968 and the spread of portable radios and vehicular patrol had the unintended effect of relegating police to being response agents rather than prevention agents. Because if crime wasn't about behavior, if it was the result of social failures and deeply entrenched inequities, and by the way, on some levels it is, then there wasn't much a cop could do other than answer calls and pick up the pieces. And there were a lot of pieces in the 70s and 80s as our society went crazy. This response model was ascendant during the eras of deinstitutionalization in the 1970s, when modern homelessness got its start as institutions, mental institutions, emptied out. A well-intended effort with unintended catastrophic consequences that we see exploding once again on the streets of America. The so-called homeless, a significant portion of that population, are people who really should be in institutions in some instances, in other environments where they can get treatment and not relegated to hanging in parks and streets of our cities where they waste away. As an aside, one place where the ability to control behavior runs up against a wall is addressing the emotionally disturbed. Providing mental health services should not be on the cops, as so many things end up being on the cops. I had the NYPD adopt a 4-day crisis intervention training program in 2015 with generous funding from the mayor's office, and more than 6,000 of New York's cops have received it. All of them will receive it over the next year. But the effectiveness of CIT shouldn't mean we stick cops with the failures of our mental health care system throughout the country, and it is another epidemic that we are dealing with in the 21st century. The response model was still in place during the 80s, when crack and hyperviolence in the cities spiraled out of control. America's homicide peak was 1980, but New York City's topped out in 1990, the year I went to New York as chief of transit police, with 2,245 murders in that city of 7.5 million people. Cops were quite simply not preventing crime. We were responding to it. When I became chief of the New York City Transit Police in 1990, I set about undoing this perception. I finally had a major police department that I could put into practice ideas that me and many of my colleagues in policing, police leadership shared, and indeed many political leaders. Root causes should absolutely be considered by police executives, by judges, by anyone whose goal is making a safer, fairer world. But for a cop on the street, what he, or increasingly she, has to act upon is not root causes, it's behavior. I demonstrated that in the transit police. And I demonstrated again at the NYPD in 94, 96 with the invention of CompStat, working with the late, great Jack Maple, one of the greatest minds in American policing that ever lived, and his partner, Chief of Department, Louis Anamone. We gave cops the ability to do what they're meant to do, prevent crime and disorder, and emphasize it. We let them go out and control behavior, always in accordance with the law, of course, which in a democracy is our proxy for what is right. Cops can't control behavior, but again, they must do it constitutionally, compassionately, consistently, and with transparency. So the pendulum swung back again in the 90s to prevention. We began taking back corners and parks and whole cities. In 2002, I went to Los Angeles, and we brought crime down there as well. Overall crime in the United States went down dramatically in the 1990s, and now we've had spikes over these last several years in some cities. It is still down overall. Los Angeles, just talking to Chief Charlie Beck yesterday, Los Angeles just had its safest summer going back to the early 1960s in terms of number of homicides. It will end this year with a lower number of homicides for the year. New York's numbers are literally astronomical in terms of the decline over the last 27 years. So we are getting it right in many cities, and we cannot lose focus on how to get it right because of the aberrations in certain other cities that, for a variety of reasons, are not experiencing the same declines. But as I've mentioned, pendulums don't rest. In New York City, the CompStat model became confused with the metrics it used. Gary McCarthy and I have had extraordinary conversations about this. He was the Deputy Commissioner for Crime Control Strategies at the time of the shift of CompStat in the 21st century. It became synonymous for zero tolerance, which it never was. Cops went from having a lot of discretion in the pre-Kerner report era, too much discretion perhaps, to having less and less in the response era, to having it returned as part of the early CompStat era, to having it taken away again as CompStat was misused in the 21st century in a quest for numbers, numbers-driven, activity-driven policing. The pendulum back and forth like a metronome. And while crime kept going down, it was flattening out. More and more enforcement, speaking specifically about New York at the moment, more and more enforcement for smaller and smaller returns. I returned to be police commissioner under Mayor Bill de Blasio, who gave me resources and political support throughout my 3 years there. 3 years of extraordinary resources, unlike anything I'd ever experienced in the previous 47. New York City's current crime control and police community achievements would have been impossible without that resourcing and support over those 3 years. That resourcing and support, unfortunately, is missing in so many American cities, and some of those with some of the worst problems that we're experiencing at the moment, I think, are reflective of that resource issue and political support, as well as other issues particular to some of those communities. I can't stress that enough. Because in many ways, what's missing in policing is not the ideas or leadership. Extraordinary leaders with extraordinary ideas we have. It's resources and political support oftentimes, and community support for those ideas and the resources to implement them. And I want you to look at the graphic that we've handed out that was distributed just prior to this meeting, a one-page graphic, and I'll speak to that now as we go through it. Look at murders and shootings on that graph from 2003 to 2012. This is New York City. Compare the inconsistent decreases in those categories, nearly flat really, with the skyrocketing rate of enforcement in the form of arrests, summonses, and the issue that metastasized so drastically in New York City, stop, question, frisk, Terry stops. Homicides leveling off, but police activity increasing dramatically, even as the city was getting safer and safer and safer. Then look at 2013, 14, 15, and 16. As enforcement plummets, violent crime doesn't rise, it falls too. The answer was something we initially called intelligence-led policing, then predictive policing, and now, assisted greatly by algorithms and vast dynamiting techniques, precision policing. Effectively, it's the CompStat of the 90s on steroids in the 21st century. I helped the department remember something it already knew. Blanket, indiscriminate enforcement isn't the key. Prevention is the key, supported by precision enforcement. This year, 2017, New York City is on track to see fewer than 300 murders, about 275 with current projections, down from 2,245 in 1990. It will have this year possibly the lowest number of homicides in modern times, going back almost 50 years. In a city with 1 million more people than it had in 1990, 8.5 million now with 60 million tourists, 100,000 tourists every day in New York City, it will go from 2,245 murders to that 275 figure. And for the first time in over 50 years, fewer than 100,000 reported Part 1 index crimes, over 500,000 in 1990 with fewer people. Chicago this year, unfortunately, has had more than 500 already, with about 30% of New York City's population. If New York had Baltimore's current homicide rate, it would have nearly 3,500 murders at this time. Instead, fewer than 300. Think about that in terms of that large American city, LA, the second largest city with many fewer police resources, both starting to continue the trend that has gone on for 20-some odd years of steady, consistent crime decline. A prediction for you in this room, and I'm a resident of New York City, that crime will not go back up in New York City. It may spike here or there from time to time, but they have found a way to effectively Prevent it, control it, and deal with it. Look again at the pictures of murders and shootings over time and then compare them with the enforcement activities we measure. You can have better outcomes with less enforcement. That's the truth. And the truth brings me to something else. Like the so-called fake news that has come to dominate public debates in this post-truth era in America, there are three falsehoods that have taken root in the public discourse, promoted by different parties. In some ways, they are mutually exclusive, but they are entrenched. There is a saying that a lie can go around the world while the truth is putting its pants on. That has happened here, and those three falsehoods are the result. The first is the falsehood of the academics, the notion that police don't control crime, they don't have an impact on it, and that there's so many sociological moving parts that no one can ever really know why crime rises and falls. I remember going to Boston in 1995 as the police commissioner in New York to talk about CompStat. And the complaint at the International Criminologists Association meeting in Boston was that in New York, we did it everywhere all at the same time. Why didn't we do half the city so they could have studied and had evidence-based understanding of what happened? Well, that would have been fine for the hundreds of lives saved in Manhattan, but the people in Brooklyn might have objected to that for experimental purposes, we not save lives. The academics can't figure it out. I believe I've figured it out. And New York City is the living example of it. And going forward, you will see evidence-based policing in that city. So everybody trying to figure out how does it go down for 27 straight years will have the answer. I think I know, because I was happy to play a part in that reduction, in that continuing reduction, and the prediction that it's not going to go up in New York City ever again to the levels that we saw in the past. Everyone who lived in New York City saw the change in the 90s, the massive plummet from 93 to 96. Why? CompStat, the cops, political leadership. Through 7 police commissioners and 4 mayors over 27 years, crime has gone down every year. Mayors of totally different political ideology, very different police managers, police chiefs, but they were all working with CompStat, they were all working with the belief that something could be done about crime. Now you're seeing on that handout that the NYPD did it again over the past 4 years. Mayor de Blasio was elected, there was predictions, New York Post and others, that Armageddon was now coming through the door with this new progressive mayor. Armageddon did not arrive, but rather 4 more years of straight crime decline. The idea being that with progressive, with liberal, with conservative, if you have the right medicines, you can have the right results. But it's a demonstrable decline, despite the fact that many academics said that crime could not go lower, and in some cases even claimed that a degree of crime increase would be tolerable if it meant less intrusive tactics. Imagine that. I think you can have less intrusive tactics and crime reduction. Well, precision policing proved them wrong and will continue to prove them wrong. The next is a falsehood from the left, that police bias is pervasive. This is false, totally false. I've been in this profession for 27 years, left it a year ago. Now look at it as an outsider. Bias exists, that's a reality, but it is not a professional issue. It is the issue of individuals, individual police officers. Some instances, unfortunately, maybe some police departments, but to paint with a broad brush, where the fine-tuning of an artist's fine brush is appropriate, is what is needed. Because the damage that is being created among American police forces in terms of their morale, the damage to the potential building of relationships among the public and the neighborhoods that need us most, by that broad brush, basically implication that American policing is fundamentally racially biased, is wrong. It is false. It is incorrect. And I do not believe that I make a mistake in making that statement. I fully acknowledge that the profession has miles to go in the pursuit of racial equality, but I reject the idea there's any further to go than society at large. And in fact, I think we're much farther along than our society at large. In our conflicted era, we also need to do a better job of seeing each other, not looking past each other. I use that expression based on a comment from Sweet Alice, black activist in Watts, came from a sharecropping farm, I believe in Mississippi or Alabama back in the 50s or 60s. And we spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, myself, my wife, the LAPD, working on developing police-community relationships. Yesterday, David Kennedy, in an article he wrote, I think, for The Hill, talked about some of the success of the LA model dealing with race issues in Watts, in the housing developments, which are the worst crime areas. We spent a lot of time on the issue of building race relations. And as I was leaving, my wife and I, to go back to New York after 7 years in LA, the LA Times editorialized, finally, a corner has been turned on race relations in Los Angeles. Sweet Alice, basically, tears in my eyes, tears in my wife's eyes, tears as we're leaving a good friend, tears in her eyes, says to me in that delightful Southern accent, "Chief, you know why we like you so much?" And I said, "No, Sweet Alice, why is that?" "You see us. You really see us." Those words, "you see us." Well, police, community, we all need to see each other. And if we make false claims, if we paint with the broad brush, we will never be able to see each other. And I would say to you that American policing, in this society that's still riven by so much racial tension as a result of our history, policing is probably going to be in a position to light the way, because we are, in truth, on the front lines of the issue every day. And with regard to the racial and ethnic diversity of the NYPD, with regard to rates of representation, I will stack that department and many other American police departments against any arm of government, any newsroom, against any corporate office or Ivy League campus, and I like my odds that the NYPD is more diverse. We reflect our city, 33% white, 40% Latino, about 18% black, 20% women. I think we now have 3 transsexual individuals who went through operations who have faced no discrimination in the department. We have over 1,000 Muslim officers in that minority and majority city with almost 700,000 Muslims. 40% of the population of New York City is foreign born. 60% of that population was not there in the 1990s, in the bad old days. So New York City, a city that works, New York City Police Department, that reflects what we are all advocating for, departments that reflect the communities they serve. All of this builds into the success that New York has been experiencing. The bullpens at many of the nation's leading newspapers could also stand to look a little more like a typical precinct roll call in New York City, if you ask me. We cannot ignore also, as I've emphasized, the great shadow of race, this nation's original sin and enduring challenge, particularly for the police. But neither can we assume that disparities in police enforcement are proof of bias when they're tied to disparities in crime rates. There is an inconvenient truth, to use Al Gore's term, that disproportionate impact reflects the reality of the cause. You would not expect a doctor or a physician to apply chemo or radiation out of proportion to the cancer that he is treating. That would be medical malpractice. Or deny treatment when it is essential. Why is that expected in the 21st century of American police? Why is it advocated? Why has it become the mantra? Data-driven or evidence-based policing is not bias policing. Cops go where the problem is, cops go where the calls are, and unfortunately in America for our minority residents, and particularly our African American and our poor, that's where the crime is, that's where the disorder is, that's where the need is, and that's where American police are. It's not driven by racial bias. The challenge for us is to ensure while we are there, we see each other. Finally, there's the falsehood of the right, which says only heavy-handed tactic can control crime. This is false. It may be the most harmful falsehood of all. The New York experience, where smarter policing has worked better than zero tolerance ever did, is proof of that. It's proof that focusing on behavior works and that bias has no place in that equation, even though it still occurs, unfortunately. I know that behavior matters more than bias because I know that the disparities that supposedly demonstrate bias are not the whole picture. Disparities in enforcement are often taken as proof of disparate treatment and disparate impact, and never contemplated as proof of disparate behavior. But that half story can be called into question by one thing: gender. No one says there should be as many women stopped, arrested, or in prison as men. No one objects to the fact that women make up only 27% of arrests. For violent crime, 80% of people arrested are men. Is there bias against them, or is it behavior the issue? Men tend to be more violent than women. That's a fact. In New York City, more than 95% of murders are perpetrated by minorities, but more than 95% of the victims are minorities also. That's a fact. That's not fake news. And these terrible imbalances remain even as the NYPD drives shootings and murders down to never-before-seen lows. The disparities are not a policing issue. It is about behavior. At this, some on the right elbow each other and say, "See, I told you." But they're wrong, too. The enforcement disparity is real, and the violence disparity is real, but so is the disparity between the part and the whole. In New York City, we're taking about 800 shooters out of talking about maybe 800 shooters out of a nearly 4.5 million population of people of color. 800 individuals who are responsible for a significant part of the shooting violence that remains in New York. We had an expression in LA when I was there: 10% of the victims account for 50% of the victimization, 10% of the locations account for 50% of the calls for service, and 10% of the criminals account for 50% of the criminal behavior. That is effectively what is at work, that small populations that can be dealt with precision, so we don't end up impacting on larger populations with inappropriate and excessive amounts of police attention. Behavior and bias are both real. So here's the good news: we can control both. Sir Robert Peel. Legally, respectfully, in a partnership with the community, as is evidenced by the neighborhood policing initiative that's growing in New York, now being led by Police Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill. We can have cops do what they do best, keep people safe, and we can have a profession that recognizes the inescapable bias and inequality and terrible history that makes whites in this country 68 times wealthier than blacks under certain formulas. We can use precision policing to focus on the impact players who push the crews toward violence and ruin neighborhoods, while using neighborhood policing to address the vast majority of the other people who don't, the law-abiding. We can and we are, and it's working. And I use New York as the example, Los Angeles to a similar extent. You have the crime numbers, and they're self-evident, but we have other numbers too, and I'll begin to close. Poll numbers show that the overall NYPD job rating and trust rating is at a 66% approval level. The president would like to have those numbers. I think he's at 32% currently. So would Congress. I think their latest is 19%. So would the media. They're at 9%. I'll take the cop numbers. I like them better. Recent New York PD polling, and they now have developed the most intimate polling of any entity in America, down to the block level in New York City. That can be done at any time. Recent NYPD polling shows that 65% of blacks and 71% of Hispanics agree that, quote, based on their personal experience, most NYPD officers in their neighborhoods treat them and those they know with respect. Falling crime, increasing satisfaction. In 2017, we have an emergent template for what to do in New York, just as we did in 1994 with Comstat, as the Attorney General referenced. There is much more to do, and we can't ever rest on our laurels. We can't ever forget that the consent of the governed is earned, not owed. But there is a template. That template does not emphasize indiscriminate enforcement, or immigration enforcement for that matter, although it does hinge on targeted enforcement of criminal behavior, no matter who commits it. Even libertarian think tanks have reported what cops know. Immigrants don't commit more crime. Maybe I shouldn't mention that here, but the Cato Institute notes that immigrants are less likely to be incarcerated also. In fact, they're far more likely to be victims than perpetrators, and pushing them into the shadows makes that much worse. We need to know where the crime is. We need to know who the victims are. And if we have policies and procedures that discourage them from working with us, then we are truly not seeing each other. If you frighten people into choosing not to report crime, it doesn't mean that crime isn't happening. The cause of crime, and always has been, people. The template does not emphasize harsher sentencing, although it does hinge on fully applying existing and appropriate sentencing for impact players. It is discriminating, not discriminatory. It is precise, not prejudiced. The opportunity, the obligation to address these issues in this way has been knocking on the door for 3 years now in New York and the nation, since the tumultuous protests of the winter of 2014 that saw protests across the country, Ferguson, the Ferguson effect, in my city, the murder of 2 police officers sitting in their car, the death of an individual at the hands of a police officer that still remains a subject of incredible controversy. The combination of tools that comprise precision policing have been building even longer than those 3 years, however. It's not the culmination of nearly half a century in the business for me, but rather the continuing evolution of the police profession, even now as I have left it, with occasional revolutions, thankfully, such as community policing in the 90s. When opportunity knocks, shouldn't we answer the door? Opportunity is banging on the door with a battering ram. Let's open it. Policing is not a government program. It's a moral covenant. It's keeping people safe. It's the underpinning and the essential element of our democracy. Our profession, the police profession, has a once-in-a-lifetime chance, the chance to change its legacy, to shape its future. It has the chance to confound expectations, to move past demagoguery, and to save lives, which is always our mission. It is the chance to make our country safe, and fair everywhere for everyone. It is, after all, what we do in policing, to try to make it safe and fair for everyone. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for this opportunity. Attorney General, thank you, sir.
Bill, thank you very much. As we leave the stage, we will have a panel coming up to discuss these comments and to add to them. So if you'll just remain in your seats, and the panel will come up, and we will take our leave, and we can sit right down here.
Awesome.
Thank you, Ed. I'm John Malcolm. I'm the Vice President of the Institute for Constitutional Government here at the Heritage Foundation. I also have the privilege of being the Director of the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. These are very difficult times for police officers. There have been spikes of crime in a number of cities over the last couple of years. Attacks, police fatalities are up. Ambushes on police officers are up. There is a tremendous amount of social unrest. We now have new terms that we didn't have before, such as the Ferguson effect. There's unrest in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Dallas, and of course this past weekend in St. Louis. There are also an increasing number of consent decrees to which police officers are now subjected. Although, as Commissioner Bratton noted, it's not all gloom and doom. There are major pockets in this country where crime is down. There have been a lot of innovations that have increased or improved policing techniques, and in many communities, the relationship between those communities and police officers is good and improving. When there was a change in administration and a new tone coming out of the Sessions Justice Department, then existed under the Holder and Lynch Justice Department, General Meese and I decided that it was time to bring together some major thought leaders in the police forces to sort of talk about the challenges that they're facing, what's working, what's not working, and perhaps how there might be changes with this administration that might affect the course of policing. So we had an off-the-record, full day, quite frank convocation of leaders, three of whom are on the stage with me today. I'm going to introduce them all briefly. They happen to be seated in the order in which they will speak. They will then give some brief remarks, and then time permitting, I'll ask Bill Bratton if he can still come back up on the stage, and we'll open it up for questions. So our first speaker is going to be Perry Tarrant. Perry is currently the Assistant Chief in charge of Special Operations Bureau in Seattle. He's a law enforcement officer with 34 years of experience. He spent most of that time in the Tucson Police Department. In 2014, he was appointed to coordinate the city of Yakima's gang-free initiatives, prevention and intervention programs, and to act as the city's emergency preparedness director. He has a master's degree from the Northern Arizona University, a certificate of graduate study in criminal justice at the University of Virginia, and a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Arizona. He also is the current president of NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Next, we'll hear from Gary McCarthy. Gary is the president and CEO of GFM Strategies. From 2011 to 2015, Gary was the police superintendent for the city of Chicago, the second largest police department in the nation. He oversaw a $1.4 billion budget and 13,000 sworn police officers. Under his leadership, Chicago saw 4 straight years of reduction in overall crime rates, the fewest violent crime incidents since the 1960s, and also a reduction in complaints against the police. Prior to that, he served as the police director for Newark, New Jersey, from 2006 to 2011, where he also saw crime reductions and reductions in complaints against the police in that city. Before that, and for much of his career, he started in the New York City Police Department, where he rose steadily through the ranks, ultimately serving, as you already heard, as Deputy Commissioner of Operations, where he was involved in planning, coordinating, and directing the response to the World Trade Center attacks and its aftermath. Gary attended the prestigious Police Management Institute at Columbia University, as well as the graduate program in Marist College in New York, and he has a bachelor's degree from SUNY University in Albany. Finally, we will hear from James Stewart, known to one and all as Chips. Chips is the Director of Public Safety and a Senior Fellow for Law Enforcement at CNA Corporation. He is a nationally recognized expert on criminal justice systems, including use of force analysis, capabilities evaluation, and technological applications such as body-worn cameras. He's currently a senior advisor to the Department of Justice's Smart Policing Initiative, which provides technical assistance and training to 35 law enforcement agencies all the way from Baltimore to Los Angeles. Prior to joining CNA, Chip served as a commander for the Oakland Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division, and he was also a White House Fellow and a Special Assistant to the United States Attorney General. And from 1982 to 1990, he was the longest-serving director in the history of the National Institute of Justice. Chips holds a Master in Public Administration from California State University and a BA from the University of Oregon, and he also earned a graduate certificate in Police Organizational Management at the FBI's Academy in Quantico. So with that, Perry, let me turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Good morning. Again, my name is Perry Tarrant. I'm actually now the past president of Noble. My term expired last month. But let me just tell you a little bit about Noble. Noble is the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. It was founded back in 1976 specifically to look at crime in urban communities, particularly how crime was not only taking place, but also looking at how enforcement was taking place within those communities. I want to thank Attorney General Meese for the invitation to be part of this discussion that took place back in March of this year. I will tell you that it was an honor to be invited. It was, to say the least, a frank conversation, and I will tell you at times not only was I uncomfortable, but I'm pretty sure I made some other folks uncomfortable at the same time during that conversation. But the product that came out of that is certainly reflective of the overwhelming sentiment of the folks who participated in that conversation. So let me begin by saying history is important. It is important for the lessons learned and self-reflections. I'd like to use a sports analogy here because we are currently in the football season. And I will tell you that, not the Giants. Sports teams and individual athletes normally review prior game films in the history for self-improvement as well as individual performance improvement. Your MVPs not only look at the collective performance, but are also critical of their own individual performances towards self-improvement and raising the bar for the team. The history of the MVP, who his parents were, where he came from, are not important to the spectator. But what is important about his performance and his history is the predictor of his performance going forward. You heard from Chief Bratton about the 9 principles of Sir Robert Peel's policing. I grew up quite a bit outside of the U.S., and law enforcement wasn't called law enforcement, it was called police service. Coming into the U.S. and learning the transition to law enforcement, it was a bit of a dichotomy. And you heard Chief Bratton talk about that pendulum swing. So there was a point in time where there was an absolute focus on service. That pendulum swung back the opposite direction, where the emphasis was largely on enforcement. but I'll continue with my analogies and talk about high-performance teams. When you start looking at organizations like the Air Force Thunderbirds or the Navy's Blue Angels, you have individual pilots that are flying at super quick speeds, doing some amazing things with aircraft. And every one of those pilots has a unique responsibility to perform at his best. Having had the opportunity to watch a debrief of a performance, every one of those pilots didn't talk about what the other person did wrong. They talked about the shortcomings of their performance, and they all promised to do better the next time they went out and flew. Policing is no different. Poor performance by one officer is reflective and reflects poorly on every officer performing in this industry. I would suggest to you that it goes far beyond that. When we start talking about history, and we talk about the history of our country, we have to talk about not just specifically policing, but talk specifically about laws formulated within this country. We've asked the police to do some pretty amazing things over the years, starting with the enforcement of segregation, the enforcement of anti-Semitic immigration, to round folks up for Japanese internment camps, and also to enforce Irish housing laws. That was the advent of the paddy wagon. As Chief Bratton mentioned earlier, contact with the police is that first contact that most people have with government. To quote a previous mayor that I worked for, the call to 911 occurs when every other system has failed. Within that capacity, in order to move forward and to have the conversation about moving forward, we have to acknowledge that history exists and that we're going to do better. Wellesley, Massachusetts Chief Terry Cunningham, retired now, the past president of IACP, acknowledged the law enforcement played a role in systems that disproportionately impacted particular populations. And let's not overlook the occasions of misconduct by law enforcement and the impact that has had on the legitimacy of policing. Speaking at Georgetown University, former FBI Director Comey acknowledged the disparate treatment as it related to enforcement by his organization or by that organization during the civil rights movement. He specifically identified the lack of substance in the search warrant affidavit to tap the phones of Dr. Martin Luther King. The summit that was held earlier this year at the Heritage Foundation focused on advancing policing. As you can imagine, with just bringing that many different perspectives into a fairly large room, there was a considerable amount of, I'd say, back and forth, but I appreciate the frankness of the conversation. The bottom line is, and again, I'll defer to the statements made by Chief Bratton, community relationships are paramount in determining police legitimacy. Relationships and legitimacy are necessary for effective policing. In fact, it is the first topical area that was listed in President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force final report. The group that was assembled here at Heritage did a phenomenal job. More importantly, we acknowledge the phenomenal job that's done by law enforcement each and every day. But we do a very poor job of telling the stories of the accomplishments on a daily basis of those cops as they go out and do their jobs. I liked the comment that was made by Chief Bratton in terms of the bad news and the false reports travel at a greater speed, travel around the world, while good deeds and the truth are still putting their pants on. part of our discussion was about data collection, and I will tell you that I absolutely believe in the value of collecting data. However, data is just data unless it's placed into context. Law enforcement organizations have been collecting data on things easy to count, numbers of arrests, traffic citations, and things of that nature. This data is important, but it's one-dimensional. More agencies are now taking on the expense of doing quality control surveys to find out more specifically how their relationship is going with their communities. The community I work in, our approval rating is a little bit higher than New York, coming in at about 71%. I also want to kind of talk about data collection as it relates to reducing crime and crime reduction. Collecting data is absolutely important when it comes to precision enforcement. We know the three things that must intersect in order for a crime to occur. You have to have an available location, you have to have an available victim, and you have to have a motivated suspect. Data-driven policing attempts to identify all three of these areas, which then allows us to place our resources in a focused manner on impacting and reducing crime. The fourth factor in reducing crime is the community, and the community must be engaged in that effort. I've used data collection to educate victims or communities to reduce their likelihood of becoming victims. We've used collected data to actually redesign locations and determine where we need to put resources. Likewise, we know who our high-impact offenders are, and collecting data on them and how they execute their crimes certainly makes us more effective at doing that. And I can give you a very specific example. While I worked as a precinct commander in an area that had a high homicide rate, we took a very analytical and methodical approach on how to reduce crime. The first thing we looked at were the folks, we looked at a lot of our historical data, those things I talked about, the citations we were collecting. We looked at who was being arrested in those areas. We took that data, went to the neighborhood, went to the businesses, and told them that we were going to take on this initiative to reduce crime in that area. We learned some things from them from just having that conversation. We then turned around and went to the community almost nearly door to door and had very similar conversations and shared the data that we'd collected. And what we learned was not just their concern for the violent crime, but more important to them than the violent crime were the issues around quality of life. Quality of life overwhelmingly was the conversation. We involved them in the strategy that we built out as it related to our response. And then we responded. We took that particular area to 0 homicides for the entire summer based on the data-driven efforts that were taken, that were initiated. I'll close out here shortly by saying it was an honor to participate in that conversation here at Heritage. There were a lot of folks that walked away from that conversation initially scratching their head. But I will have to commend Mr. Malcolm for continuing that conversation and that back and forth, and more importantly, for generating the document that you now have in front of you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Gary McCarthy. I just got to tell you, I'm always fascinated listening to Bill Bratton speak. I've known him since 1994, worked for him in the NYPD, But today I learned something. I finally beat you at something, Bill. I made sergeant at 26. That's the one thing I got. That's all I got, guys. But I'm really pleased to be here, and General Meese, I want to thank you and John for having me participate in this endeavor. I put a paper together talking about quote-unquote systemic racism. I have a big problem with what's been happening, especially in the last administration from the Department of Justice. I dealt with it in Newark, New Jersey. I didn't deal with it in Chicago because I was never invited to the conversation when they put together their report. And I think that if you're going to investigate the policies and practices of a police department, you should probably start with the individual who implemented the policies and practices of that police department. And I found it incredibly troubling when Loretta Lynch was in Chicago releasing that report and got up in front of national and international news audience and said, somebody asked her, how come you didn't interview Gary McCarthy? And she said that they attempted to get in touch with me, but were unable to do that. And I responded, with all the resources of the Federal Investigative Services, you couldn't find me in River North, Chicago. So I have a big problem with the way that a lot of things have played out, and I think that politics played way too much of a role in what's happening. That's kind of the summation of my paper. Both Bill and Perry have framed some of the same issues that I'm going to mention. They came up during our conversations back here in March, and they're going to continue to come up. So simply stated, in my mind, the single most challenging issue to policing is what happened in the last administration, in that data-driven policing, as Bill talked about, is now considered systemic racism. We got to put that genie back in the bottle eventually, because we really can't do our jobs without doing it, without having data-driven policing. CompStat, Bill already talked about. We put more resources where and when crime happens, looking for who's going to commit crime to prevent the next crime, putting the cops on the dots, if you will. That's CompStat, developed into data-driven policing, which is now precise policing, which is getting better and better. It's no secret that those neighborhoods where the disenfranchised communities exist across this country, in our urban centers, is generally minority, depending on the part of the country, in many cases mostly African American. And those communities suffer through a number of issues, whether it's poverty, breakup of the family unit, lack of education, poor resources, no optimism, no jobs, poor health care, lead in the water. This all sounds familiar, right, folks? Rampant narcotics, rampant crime, rampant alcohol abuse. This creates something called legal cynicism, which I know most of you know what it is, but legal cynicism is defined as a cultural orientation in which the law and the agents of its enforcement are viewed as illegitimate, unresponsive, and ill-equipped to ensure the public safety. Just think about that. The law is illegitimate. And it's not talking just about the police. It's an indictment of the entire system of government that is not providing what those communities need. Look at Flint, Michigan. Look at what happened there. So, in my mind, what we're looking at now is legal cynicism on steroids. And as Perry and Bill rightfully point out, the most forward element of that failed government system are the police. We're in people's living rooms. We're on the street with them. We are the point of the spear for the government. You don't see the state's attorneys on the street. You don't see U.S. attorneys on the street. You don't see elected officials on the street, unless they're campaigning, of course, or unless there's an anti-police march these days. But the problem is the political reaction to questionable incidents. And by the way, questionable incidents do occur, whether it's Baltimore, Kevin, whether it's Laquan McDonald in Chicago, whether it's Ferguson. Questionable incidents occur. The problem is the political reaction to those events is making things worse. We've misdiagnosed the problem. The problem in this country is not the police. The problem in this country is the social and economic divide that puts people in those disenfranchised communities in the positions that they're in. So, in essence, we're taking the wrong medicine for what ails us. That's what I believe. The simplest way to describe it. And the result is, what we're doing, and certainly Chicago is the worst example of it, we're emboldening criminals while hamstringing the police at the same exact time. Now, Chicago, talk about a misdiagnosed problem. Not during my tenure, but Chicago, in 2015, less than half of 1% of the shootings in the city of Chicago were police-related shootings. Less than half of 1%. So what does that mean? That means if there wasn't one of those 19 police-related shootings that existed in 2015, there still would have been 4,300 people shot in Chicago in 2015. The police are not the problem, okay? The political reaction to Laquan McDonald has resulted in a huge increase in the crime rate because of the landscape that's been created in places like Chicago. There's a lot of accountability for this, and I use the word accountability because that's the word that's always used when we're talking about the police. And the accountability goes to elected officials, it goes to community leaders, but in my mind, the worst offender over the last 8 years was the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice, by saying that we're engaging in systemic racism and pointing to investigations, which, by the way, I believe they did 25 investigations during the time frame of the Obama administration. Each one of them came to the same conclusion. They're methodologically flawed as far as investigative. I think that the conclusions were predetermined, and if you watch the methods that they used, they go to a city and they take testimonials and then they say, aha. The problem is that they draw the same conclusion almost exclusively, that the departments that they investigate are engaging in systemic racism. Now, we all know about Terry stops. Terry stops, the quote-unquote stop, question, and frisk issue that we faced in New York and across the country. The Department of Justice has changed the Supreme Court decision with their findings. Terry stops come from the 1968 case of Terry versus Ohio, and they say that you can stop somebody, the police can stop somebody, based on reasonable, articulable suspicion. In their findings now, the Department of Justice constantly comes up with the phrase that we're disproportionately stopping someone. In the investigation of the Puerto Rican police, they said that the Puerto Rican police were using excessive force against Dominican individuals. Primarily, you hear it all the time that we're disproportionately stopping African Americans. The reason that they come up with this is because they compare the population demographics to the SOP data. In the city of Chicago, if we went before the Supreme Court and we said that we were using population demographics as basis to stop people, I believe that the Supreme Court would say it's unconstitutional, based upon reasonable, articulable suspicion. We did a 2-year analysis of crime in Chicago, who, where, and when crime was occurring. There's a couple of charts that are attached to my paper that are in your books. But 32% of the population of Chicago is African American, yet citywide, 70% of our stops for a 2-year period, 2013 and 2014, were African American. The problem is, suspect data from crime victims had it that 72% of the offenders were described as male blacks. So in a city that has an out-of-control crime rate, in a neighborhood of Englewood, which is 97% African American, where we have the highest volume of violent crime, we're expected to stop 32% Caucasian individuals. First of all, it's impossible because they're not there. But second of all, what impact would that have on the crime rate in Englewood? Don't the individuals who live there deserve to live in safety? The bottom line is stop data in Chicago closely mirrors crime data. The charts in your book show that. The only demographic that was stopped at a higher rate than the crime data for the 2-year period in Chicago were Caucasians. Everybody else patches up almost precisely across, across all the boards that you look at. For 2013 and 2014, what were the results that we had? During the analysis that I gave you, we had 1965 murder rates in the city of Chicago. We had a 40% reduction in overall crime. We made 20,000 less arrests, as Bill pointed out. You don't arrest your way out of the problem. Everybody loves to say it. I hate that phrase, but it's factual. It's factual. You don't arrest everybody, you arrest the right people. With 20,000 less arrests, we made 23% more gun arrests. Chicago takes more guns off the street than any city in the country every year, 3-to-1 in comparison to Los Angeles, 7-to-1 in comparison to New York City. Yet, we had a 68% reduction in police-related shootings during my tenure. That's a fact that's certainly not out there. At the same time, we had a 50% reduction in complaints against our officers. So it's not all bad, but shootings and murders have gone up 85% from those numbers that we got them down to in 2013 and 2014. And the almost 800 murders in Chicago last year represents more than the 2245 when you look at per capita that Bill mentioned in New York City in 1990, the worst year we ever had. So what are the fixes? The fixes are simple. There's no political solutions for practical problems. It starts with truth-telling. Perry mentioned how some of us felt uncomfortable in the room because everybody's uncomfortable when we talk about race. Putting body cameras on is not going to reverse 300 years of racist laws that were enforced by the white police officer. And every one of our interactions is viewed through the prism of history. We have to have some truth-telling. We have to talk about our history as a nation. It's going to make us very uncomfortable. But the first step towards redemption is recognition. We got to recognize the problems, what we did to ourselves, how we got ourselves in this position. You can't reestablish something that hasn't existed. And I love to hear when we're going to reestablish trust in the African American community. But we have to recognize the social and economic problems and actually address them, not put Band-Aids on a gunshot wound. And the last thing that we need to do is establish the constitutionality of data-driven policing in a public forum because we cannot do our job without the understanding and clarification of that. We do not engage in systemic racism by addressing crime patterns. It's called intelligent policing. This misapplied characterization represents the greatest danger to modern policing. We cannot establish the trust that we never had without it. Present-day Chicago is the most glaring example of that today. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, and Perry as well. And thank you, Bill Bratton, for your continuing career in public service. And thanks to the Heritage Foundation, and particularly to Ed Meese, for sponsoring this forum and for bringing this attention to this most serious of all of our kinds of problems that we're facing in our communities. Both Bill and General Meese talked a little bit about the executive sessions, and to some extent, Heritage is continuing that kind of dialogue with having, as you've heard today, multiple voices coming together to discuss what they consider to be the most urgent problems. And I think that's commendable, and I'm glad to see my friend Kevin Davis here from Baltimore. Dwayne Crawford is here from Noble. Chuck Wexler from Perf. Vince DeLucci is here from the ICP, and we're really grateful to have Tom Manger to be here as well from the Montgomery Police Department, and also the major city chiefs. We're really fortunate to have that kind of attention and this community of support that are coming together to hear from the Heritage Foundation, who is sponsoring this event. I think it's very important. Let me say that there's a couple of papers in here that I've had the chance to share some views. And one of the things I want to talk about is this idea of crime without consequences. That turns out to be really a tale of two cities. And I'm not talking about New York and Los Angeles. I'm talking about within the same city. That citizens look to their local police to preserve life and property and to maintain the peace. And these noble objectives have become a little more elusive in the second year in a row because violent crime rates, especially homicide rates, have risen in many major cities. In the end of 2016, 13 cities, including Houston and Philadelphia, San Antonio, and a lot of others, have experienced increases in violent crime. Chicago, as Gary talked about, just reported its 500th homicide already this year. It's what wasn't spoken about is they had 800 carjackings so far this year. It's not happening throughout that city. It's happening in certain neighborhoods. And that's the tale of the two cities. And even in Charlotte, North Carolina, they've had a spike of 13% involving drug homicides. But more troubling than that, and this is something that hasn't been talked about, is that the police are solving far fewer homicides than we have in the past. The Philadelphia Inquirer concluded in 2017 that, quote, people are getting away with murder. The homicide clearance average rate for the large cities has been in steep decline for the last 60 years. From around 90% when Ed Meese was assistant district attorney in Oakland and I was a police officer there, 90% down to less than 60% in the 50s that are currently happening now. The impact of falling crime rates can be seen by a quick calculation. There have been, if you do the back of the envelope kind of calculation, there have been 211,000 homicides that have not been solved in that period of time. Those are people that, A, haven't been held accountable, and B, that may have gone out to kill again because the police were not able to prevent that. In some Chicago neighborhoods, according to public statements by the police superintendent, the clearance rates for homicides are in the single digits, and suspects may never be arrested. A murder for violent crime generates growing attention across the country. Shortfalls in criminal justice systems, ability to hold the offenders accountable, and provide a protection for the citizens, a prime obligation of government, demand a greater priority and attention. But there's a situation that's occurring that also, it's not just on the police. The police in many large cities are struggling not only with the higher volumes of serious and violent crime, but also with communities that have increasing lower levels of trust in and cooperativeness with the police. Former Dallas Police Chief David Brown says that community anger at the police have left criminals emboldened to commit violent crime and resist or attack the police. The police and their communities are at risk and need help in reversing these disturbing trends. And with low clearance rates in these select neighborhoods, individuals who commit murder and other violent crimes have an overwhelming probability of never being held accountable. In some communities, witnesses are afraid to help the police because they believe, A, nothing will happen to the perpetrator, and B, that they will be targeted for reprisals as snitches. And even with sophisticated new technologies like forensic DNA that was developed here at the federal government, digital cameras, facial recognition technology, gunshot detection, integrated data systems, and in-car computers, often missing are the updated investigatory techniques, effective use of street intelligence, and cooperative community providing information, including servicing as witnesses and participating in criminal trials. The police need real assistance to address these challenges with practices that are evidence-based and practical for the officer in the field. For body-worn cameras are one example of a practical technology that is being adopted by the police department that is being lauded and praised by stakeholders in the community, advocates for better policing and better training, and have been embraced by police unions as a way to quickly exonerate police officers where their behavior has been correct and according to policy, and holding officers in the rare cases where that they show that they violated the training that they've received, that available for some kind of sanctions and improvement in their behavior. That has been a game changer, because no longer do you spend 6 months trying to figure out who was responsible and end up by saying, well, we can't tell because he said, she said. And in this way, with body-worn cameras, within a few hours, you can get a result, and you get a result that ends up with a definitive answer in terms of whether the police conduct was in fact correct or was in violation of policy. Let me just say that the interesting thing about police cameras is that many people speculated that people wearing body-worn cameras would de-police, would be less involved in policing. In an experiment that was done by CNA in Las Vegas, they did the largest experiment wearing body-worn cameras, and they found out that there was about a 15% increase in self-initiated activities in both pedestrian and vehicle stops by police officers wearing body-worn cameras than those that didn't wear the body-worn cameras. This was a random assignment. It had more than 400 officers involved, and the evidence is pretty phenomenal in terms of being remarkable. Well, what are these kinds of circumstances that we're facing, both the incidents of racial hostility that we're hearing, the police, the distrust of the police, and the low clearance rates? I have proposed a series of things for the Trump administration, the criminal justice thing, and one has to do with obviously reducing violent crime and other serious crimes. And the first thing I'd like to say is that they ought to expand the existing technical assistance programs that provide analytical and technical support to local police agencies to combat crime and others and murder. And what I'm suggesting by that is they need to increase the kind of work that's going on right now in the public safety partnerships in 15 different locations, and the smart policing that was developed at CNA that now is working in over 45 jurisdictions that's demonstrated crime reductions and important lessons learned through innovative approaches and quasi-experimental designs. For example, the smart policing pairs an analyst with the police department and a research partner to work together as partners in not only identifying the problem, but solving it, so that you don't get a researcher who then says, I gotcha, issues a report and walks away, but somebody that works in partnership with the police that actually are responsible for helping solve that problem. For instance, in the LA Police Department, Bill's former department, and he was there when they introduced smart policing, they piloted new strategies in your favorite district, the Shoot and Newton, and they reorganized that, and by using an analyst and 2 detectives, they zeroed in on these hot spots, and they were able to reduce commercial burglaries by 20%. And the project proved so successful that Charles Beck is now beginning to migrate that through every district in the LAPD. In the Boston Police Department, they leveraged the grants from SPI to reduce homicides, and they now have a reduction of 15% in the number of homicides and an increase in the clearance rates by 35%. There are things that can be done, but police do need some help. It's not that you just say, well, let's get a new chief. There has to be a comprehensive way to make a difference in that. In Richmond, California, with technical assistance, they moved from 38% solution of homicides to 66%. And in Oakland, they went from a low of 57% to 74% after this kind of federal assistance that worked together. I also think that providing best practices for real-time crime centers, that was something that has been done by Bill Bratton and many others to be able to be sure that they are identifying areas where crime needs to be prevented and move in much more effective ways. I would just like to say that that they need to work. Another idea is to work more closely with these task forces, and I'd suggest that you look at the New Jersey, New York one that's going on with the executive district attorney. They're doing a great job with the police and helping them. And Chauncey Parker is the person. But there's much more ground that can be done in community partnerships. And I would suggest that they look at things like Weed and Seed and Project Safe Neighborhood that really made a difference and were embraced by the Clinton administration, by the Bush administration, and abandoned, quite frankly, abandoned by the Obama administration, that needs to be recast for modern days, today. This is an opportunity for the Trump administration to begin to make a difference and to use the research money and the technical assistance money to actually address things that are relevant to the local police, because that's where the measure has to come from. It should not come from Washington, and the police have to conform, but it should respond and work with, as partners, with the local police. And with that, I'd like to close and turn it back to John Malcolm and cede the remaining part of my time to the audience for questions. How's that?
So I should have known that, first of all, thank you. Thank you. That with this many speakers with stuff to say, that we were probably going to run a little bit long. Bill, that clock is 5 minutes fast. If I could ask you perhaps to come join us. I know you have a hard stop. You got to go? Okay. Well, come on up for one question, and then maybe we'll take one more. We'll let you speak first. I just want to have people to have an opportunity to ask you something. So I will not take moderator's prerogative. I will just turn this right over to audience questions. Bill will stay for one question. He'll speak first and duck out, and then we'll talk for max 10 minutes and leave it at that. So any hands up here? There's a hand in the back. Do we have a microphone back there? Okay.
I would like a comment from Bill Bratton on the militarization of police departments and the equipment coming from military and the impact on that on community perceptions.
I'll be brief. The militarization, as it's called, is, I think, maybe somewhat of an overdramatic term. The reality of policing in the 70s, 80s, 90s was that the violence levels the police were dealing with required that police administrators, police leaders, and others equip our officers to deal with what they're experiencing. Starting in the 70s with bulletproof vests, improved training. In New York City, during my time in the last year, every one of those police cars in New York City now are equipped with ballistic doors, ballistic windows. In the trunk of every police car, ballistic helmets and heavy-duty vests, so that as officers respond to the increasing concern, either terrorism, active shooters. Just this week alone, we've seen, I think, 3 incidents in schools of active shooters. We have an obligation to our officers to give the appropriate equipment, appropriate training, appropriate supervision. So I think one of the Ferguson effects was the inappropriate appearance and potential use of some equipment that had been given to police personnel. But some of the reality of what we may potentially face, we have an obligation to our officers. The obligation also is to ensure that what we acquire or what might be given by the military is in fact appropriately used in appropriate circumstances. That's part of the challenge. But the reality is, there was reference to the ambushing of police, the increase in murders of police over the past year or so. That's the reality that we face, and we have an obligation if we're going to ask them to go in harm's way. Active shooters now, we used to tell them, wait outside, Columbine. Now they go right through the door. We have that obligation to try and save their lives as they're trying to go through the door to save other lives.
I know you've got to run.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am going to apologize. I went over on my prepared remarks with extemporaneous, and I do have to apologize. I have a plane I have to catch. So thank you so much for your attention today, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation, certainly General, to you, as always, for the opportunity to, although I'm no longer in the business, I still live in this country, I still live in this city, and I am still concerned. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So let me ask you guys whether you have, anything you want to say about the, it was the ending of the 1033 program, that was the surplus military equipment. Now it's coming back. Do you have anything you want to say about this, the so-called militarization of the police?
Yeah, I think it's another example of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and it's a political overreaction. I could tell you that at the time I was the vice president of the Major City Chiefs Association when Ferguson went on, and we were all aghast in policing, at least I'm speaking for myself, my polling, if you will call it that, at the way those protests were handled. The police can turn a protest into a riot. And, you know, you don't have Bearcats on the front line of a protest. You don't have people with rifles pointing them into a crowd saying that they're using the telescope as binoculars. I got an idea, get a set of binoculars, right? So you throw out the baby with the bathwater. In Chicago, we had an incident while I was there where there was an active gun battle that went on for about 45 minutes. And we used our Bearcats to extricate 30 civilians and 10 light-vested officers from inside the red zone. That's the way you use it. You don't use it in the fashion that it was used in Ferguson. So one picture of one individual police officer spurred this whole thing. And as Bill rightfully points out, we have an obligation to not only protect our officers, but protect the public. And we're not talking about, you know, 22 revolvers on the street anymore. We're talking about AK-47s and high-velocity bullets. So
We have time for one more question.
Let me just,
Go ahead, I'm sorry, Joe.
I want to just weigh in a little bit. We did a lot of work at the National Institute of Justice. One of the things I tried to do is give police alternatives to the kinds of ways to help arrest or suppress or de-escalate incidents by working on chemical mace or chemical spray, working on what eventually became the taser, as giving some alternatives to police. I think the federal government can do a lot more than just give us surplus military equipment. I think the federal government needs to design equipment that is for the police task. And I think that's one of the things that has made an error. I think the police need to advocate more for their own DARPA, their own research area. The police, in a very small budget at the National Institute of Justice, developed the bullet-resistant vest, which has saved thousands of lives, that the military now uses. That they developed the things like the taser and these other kinds of things that are very important but police-specific. And we haven't got enough of that kind of support. There needs to be more of that, and that somehow is being frowned upon by lots of people, but the police really need it. They can't rely on getting surplus tanks from somebody or flamethrowers, because that's not what we're going to use. On the other hand, Gary is right that we're being confronted with active shooters. We just had something happen in the Navy Yard. We did the after-action report of this. There was this baseball thing that happened in Alexandria, Virginia. The Alexandria people are here. They did a very fine job of that. The question is that the police are getting better at what they do, thanks to the fact that they're getting, more scrutiny, but they're also getting more resources. So let me just say, the police can't be able to figure this out on their own. They've got to have some help. Thanks. Go ahead.
So I did point down to Scott Erickson. I'm not going to take it back. So quick question and quick answers. You got a microphone right here, Scott.
So thank you, John and General Meese, for doing this. I spent 19 years in law enforcement, culminating in the end of my career earlier this year. The Ferguson effect is one of the most lamentable things I saw take place over the past few years of my career. And while I think we can all come up with ideas on how local officials can help motivate officers to go back out and be more proactive, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what the federal government can do to help motivate state and local law enforcement officers at the line level to actually get out there and be more proactive. And we talked about the depoliticization of the DOJ, which is huge. The Obama administration was not good for law enforcement, in my opinion, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I agree with the last statement you made. It was probably, seriously, and you know, I had the opportunity to meet the president on a number of occasions. I found him very engaging, and he listened to us. Tom Major, myself, and a couple other chiefs sat with the president on a couple of different occasions. He heard us. But the application of whatever happened after that, I can't explain. I think that the federal government, police officers need to know that they have support. And the political landscape in this country has changed dramatically over the last few years in places like Baltimore, Chicago, various places across the country, and everything we do. The recommendations that I have as far as acknowledging our history, looking at the social economic issue, not necessarily blaming the police for everything, is something that needs to happen on all levels of government. And you know, unfortunately, We see a lot of government inaction, especially here in Washington these days. And I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but on the lower levels, I think it's easier to probably push that through.
I think one of the things with the Ferguson effect that you're talking about is the ubiquity of cell phones. The fact is that there's snippets of cell phone footage that show something that looks awful that might be lawful, and it gets repeated, and it seems like it's happening next door. It may be happening 3 time zones away, but the problem is that locally you get that. The other thing I think that has slowed down this public is that the police themselves have been slow to get a narrative out about what happened.
Can't.
And because, well, Gary and I disagree about that, but I'll tell you, the district attorney will call Gary up and say...
Have you ever met the Chicago Press?
Right. I did. I spent some time with their editorial boards. But the police, when they hold off on getting any information out on a shooting or a controversial incident, and they wait for 6 months or 9 months, another narrative is picked up that is based on what Perry talked about, this generational history of abuse by police enforcing laws that have been Jim Crow and other situations that have occurred, housing discrimination laws. And by waiting for the courts or somebody else to tell the narrative, it is told over dinner tables and over bars and in barbecues every day how the police have abused it and how they're cooking up another story. So that in order to help with that, there's something that we can do collectively to get that information out. And quite frankly, body-worn cameras has helped stimulate that because it's only in response to the cell phones. If the cell phones weren't there, the body-worn cameras would not be as urgent as they are today to get the rest of the story out.
Well, thank you. The bottom line is all policing is local. So whatever the dictate or the mandate is at the federal level, the responsibility to address crime occurs locally. The motivation of the personnel at that local level belongs to that chief or that sheriff.
Thank you all for being here at Heritage Day, and please join me in thanking our speakers.